Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening and welcome to Alaska Weather. I'm Sam Albanese from the National Weather Service. And to get started, we'll take a look at our fire danger map. Ironically, we do have high to extreme danger in basically the interior north of the Alaska Range up into the upper Yukon Valley. However, we do have flood watches out for much of this area in anticipation of the system that's going to be moving into the area and bringing rainfall into that region. Basically, by tomorrow, anywhere from 1 to 2 inches of rainfall is expected along the north slopes of the Brooks Range and in this general area. So while the fire danger is pretty high right now, it's going to rapidly diminish and decrease. Now, down into the Copper River Basin, we still do have some moderate to extreme fire danger. They did not have the benefit of much, if any, of the rain that fell over the south central region and the North Gulf Coast this morning. And overnight. We also have some high fire danger in the interior portions of the Seward Peninsula. Now, taking a look at our satellite imagery and we'll see what's going on. This system that's basically spinning up, coming off the Russian Far East, is going to be moving on into the Bering Sea coast. That's going to be pushing a significant amount of moisture. There's already a system that's a low that's in the interior. That's going to be entraining that moisture into that system. That's what's going to be feeding the moisture and the heavy precipitation that we're anticipating in the interior. Taking a look at the GOES satellite over the state of Alaska, here's our low pressure system this morning over the Kodiak Island area, the front in an arc right along the North Gulf Coast down towards southeast Alaska. As this front approached the coast this morning, and actually overnight last night and this morning, winds were gusting upwards of 70 miles an hour in the Portage Valley area, and along with that, they had nearly 6 inches of rainfall in that time period associated with this front. So this is more typical of what you'd expect to see in the fall than what you would expect to see in June for our neck of the woods. Running that loop one more time. The thing also to notice is how this front pushed up along southeast Alaska, and even though it looks clear behind this front, there's a lot of low clouds that are going to be rolling in behind it and still showery precipitation type of scenario. They did get rainfall throughout much of southeast Alaska today, which takes us to our map for today. And as you can see, here's our front. It was coming in along the North Gulf Coast and southeast Alaska earlier today. It actually is almost through southeast Alaska. Rain in advance of that front throughout southeast Alaska into the south central region, Prince William Sound. As I said earlier, very heavy precipitation fell in the Portage Valley area. Around the backside of this low, some showery type activity across Kodiak Island. In the interior, as the afternoon progressed, there was actually a lot of clear areas on the north side of the Alaska Range, and that was because of that cross mountain flow, as you would typically see drying on the leeward side of the mountains, and the daytime heating, as well as the abatement of that strong cross barrier flow, resulted in some thunderstorm activity developing in the Kuskokwim Valley, right on up into the Tanana Valley, upper Yukon Valley, and across the western interior towards the Galena area south of the Brooks Range there. The Arctic coast generally had some pretty much benign weather today, generally some cloudy conditions, sunny conditions on the eastern Arctic coast. And out across the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula, although with somewhat gusty west-northwest winds across the Alaska Peninsula, generally calm conditions throughout much of the Aleutian Islands by Aleutian Island standards, and rather benign weather, and the same thing in the Pribilof Islands. Taking a look at the forecast for tonight. By tonight, our low pressure system is still sitting along the North Gulf Coast. The front is actually dissipated as it's moved inland, and then we're starting to see basically like a warm frontal boundary associated with that low up in the interior, extending on down into British Columbia. But the net result is onshore flow into southeast Alaska. Expect rain to continue in the Panhandle. Rain is going to continue around this low pressure system in the Prince William Sound area, become more widespread over the Cook Inlet region in the form of showers. Still expect some isolated thunderstorm activity up into the Susitna Valley, Kuskokwim Valley, in the eastern interior right on up to the eastern Brooks Range, and shower activity as well associated with all those thunderstorms right on up to Kotzebue Sound and also towards the eastern Norton Sound region. Now, this next system is coming across the northern Bering Sea near St. Lawrence Island tonight. This is going to be pushing moisture on up into the Bering Sea coast. So by morning, expect rain to be falling in the Kuskokwim Delta region associated with this system. And there's even a possibility that you're going to see some rain coming down towards the Unalaska Dutch Harbor area. It looks like it's going to stay to the north of that region, but there's an outside chance that you might see some light rain there. The Pribilof Islands should see rain associated with this warm front. And then behind the low with that cold front trailing across the Bering Sea, some shower activity to the west. Taking a look at the forecast now for Wednesday. We still have our low pressure system near Prince William Sound. That's going to continue to facilitate the rainy conditions in the Sound along the North Gulf Coast, although it does look like the northern Panhandle might get a break in the rain by the afternoon. Much of the interior portions of the Panhandle should see rain at least throughout the morning hours, and by the afternoon you might see some breaks in the clouds and the rain tapering off. Shower activity into the Copper River Basin, even the Susitna Valley. Some isolated thunderstorm activity on the north side of the Alaska Range and the Kuskokwim Valley right on up into the Tanana Valley, the central interior right on up into the upper Yukon Valley and the eastern Brooks Range. Up along the Arctic coast, we are expecting foggy conditions overnight Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. Then we have our low pressure system along the coast of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta coast. Expect rain around this low pressure system, and this is what's going to be kind of feeding the moisture into our system in the eastern interior, and therefore looking out for the potential for flooding as we move on into Thursday. Rain also expected out across the Bering Sea over the Pribilof Islands to the low pressure system that'll be sitting in the Russian Far East there. In the Aleutian Islands, conditions are generally remaining rather benign. Light winds, breaks in the clouds, so pretty calm conditions out there by Aleutian Island standards. Taking a look now at the forecast for Thursday. By Thursday, we have low pressure in the southwest Gulf of Alaska. Not really any low pressure left along the north Gulf Coast, although expect weak onshore flow. The showers are going to be mainly the result of upper level flow pattern forcing. So there's going to be some showery activity along the north Gulf Coast down to Kodiak Island. Even expect the potential for some light rain or showers in that Bristol Bay area near Iliamna. Southeast Alaska, expect generally cloudy conditions, but we're not expecting rain on Thursday there. In the interior, eastern interior, right on across the state to the Kuskokwim, Yukon and Kuskokwim Delta and that Norton Sound Seward Peninsula area, generally cloudy conditions. There's a chance that you'll see some showers, isolated type shower activity across much of these regions, but for the most part, drying conditions. And also along the Brooks Range, south of the Brooks Range, with this low pressure system and trough extending out to the western Brooks Range, expect shower activity along that area. North of the range, some breaks in the clouds, but generally speaking, mostly cloudy in that area. As we take a look out towards the Aleutian Islands, we see a system coming into the picture south of the central to western Aleutian Islands. This will bring some rain across that area and kick up the winds just a little bit, but generally expect some rain, but nothing real bad with that system is really expected. Taking a look now at temperatures around the state today. Southeast Alaska, temperatures stayed generally in the 50s. Same thing along the North Gulf Coast as you would expect with the cloudy, wet conditions that we're experiencing today. We did see some temperatures get up into the low to mid 60s up into the Susitna Valley. And the Copper River Basin generally stayed rather cool today, a function of the cloud cover. North of the Alaska Range in the Tanana Valley, as you can see, temperatures got into the mid to upper 60s in that area. Changing our focus more to the northern part of the state, as you can see up along the Arctic coast, temperatures in the 30s to low 40s. Along the Brooks Range, upper 50s and 60s. As we move on over towards Kotzebue Sound, temperatures predominantly in the 40s, although it looks like Kotzebue got up to about 53. Nome hit 57. And then as we move on down to the Yukon Delta region, generally speaking, temperatures in the 50s until you get right along the coast, where temperatures were a bit cooler with the onshore type flow pattern in the low to mid 40s along the Bering Sea coast. Bristol Bay temperatures generally in the 50s. The Alaska Peninsula, low 40s to low 50s. Pribilof Islands and the eastern Aleutian Islands generally in the mid 40s. Adak did get up to about 50 degrees today and 44 degrees out at Shemya. Taking a look at our low temperature forecast for tonight, expect temperatures in the Panhandle to be generally in the 40s. This 32 is incorrect here, so generally in the 40s throughout much of southeast Alaska. Along the North Gulf Coast, temperatures generally in the 40s as well into the eastern interior. Some lower 50-degree readings can be expected further north into the upper Yukon Valley in the central interior. Along the Arctic coast, temperatures are going to be hovering right around that freezing mark over the western Arctic coast and in the mid-30s to the east. Southwestern Alaska, expect temperatures in the 40s, as well as across the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands and Pribilof Islands. For our highs tomorrow, expect your temperatures in southeast Alaska to stay in the 50s, much like they did today. 50-degree readings along the south central region and north Gulf Coast, a little bit warmer than temperatures that we experienced today, although up into the Susitna Valley, expect things to be a little bit cooler. Copper River Basin generally in the 50s. 60-degree readings can be expected up into the eastern interior, right on down the Yukon River Valley until you get towards the coast, where it's going to be a little bit cooler. Temperatures only expected to be in the low to mid 50s there. 40s along the coast. Bristol Bay, expect your temperatures to be in the mid 50s. Temperatures along the Alaska Peninsula right around 50 degrees for the most part, and in the Pribilofs mid 40s. In the Aleutian Islands, generally expecting temperatures to be in the mid 40s to low 50s. On the Arctic coast, a little bit warmer conditions can be expected tomorrow than what was experienced today. Temperatures generally around 40 degrees over the western Arctic coast and the upper 40s as you move over to the eastern Arctic coast. Taking a look now at our flying weather, expect marginal to IFR conditions along the North Gulf Coast, marginal conditions in the northern Panhandle, marginal in Prince William Sound, to IFR as you move a little bit further west. IFR conditions along the Alaska Range, but marginal conditions throughout the eastern interior right on down to Bristol Bay. IFR conditions over the eastern Bering Sea, and also some IFR conditions up along the Arctic coast, predominantly for fog along the Arctic coast. And generally speaking, out across the Aleutians and Bering Sea, pretty much widespread marginal VFR conditions can be expected. For our passes, expect marginal conditions for Anaktuvik as well as Adigan Pass. IFR conditions for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass. Rainy Pass, expect marginal to IFR conditions. Same thing for Windy Pass, expect marginal to IFR conditions there as well. Marginal to IFR conditions over Isabel Pass and marginal conditions in Mentasta Pass. Tonita Pass, expect marginal to VFR conditions throughout the day tomorrow. Portage Pass, pretty much IFR conditions all day there, and marginal conditions can be expected in both Chilkoot and White Pass. Taking a look at our freezing levels, basically freezing levels at the surface north of the northwest Arctic coast, sloping up to about 4,000 feet as you get towards the Brooks Range. Generally about 4,000 to 6,000 feet over much of the interior. Same thing with southeast Alaska, around 5,000 to 6,000 feet there. Expect freezing levels sloping up to about 8,000 to 10,000 feet as we get over towards the eastern Aleutians, and generally running around 10,000 to 11,000 feet along the Aleutian Islands. For icing tomorrow, expect some isolated moderate mixed icing from your freezing level to about 15,000 feet, essentially from the northern Panhandle along the North Gulf Coast into Prince William Sound, and then also over the Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta on up to the St. Lawrence Island region. For our jet stream tomorrow, expect the jet stream to be about 100 knots coming off of south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, rapidly decreasing to about 35 knots on the top of the ridge, and then 55 knots as you come on down south of the Alaska Peninsula to 80 knots south of the Gulf of Alaska, 65 knots coming up through British Columbia and the Yukon Territory, 100-knot jet across the Pribilof Islands also for tomorrow. At 9,000 feet, expect generally light winds over southeast Alaska, about 20-knot winds along the North Gulf Coast, over the interior 20 to 30-knot winds around that low pressure system, with about 15 knots along the Arctic coast, 20 to 40-knot winds around our low near Nunivak Island, 50-knot winds coming around the backside of that low across the eastern Aleutians to the Alaska Peninsula down to about 45 knots, and along the Aleutian Islands themselves, basically about 10 to 15 knots can be expected there. Down to the 3,000 foot level, 10 to 15 knot winds right under the ridge, increasing to 30 knots over the eastern to central Aleutian Islands, 25 to 35 knots across the Alaska Peninsula, 25 knots across Kodiak Island, 10 to 15 knots in the Gulf, to 10 to 15 knots over southeast Alaska, 20 knots along the North Gulf Coast. Generally light winds over the majority of the interior with some strong winds right around the backside of that low over the Kuskokwim Delta region. And for turbulence, expect some isolated moderate turbulence below 3,000 feet, basically across the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern Aleutian Islands. That wraps up this portion of the show. Enjoy the segment and come back for the marine forecast.
Her name is Patty Wagstaff, one of the most celebrated aerobatic pilots of all time. Three-time U.S. National Aerobatic Champion, she is the first woman to win this title. Because of her achievements, Patty has been honored by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum as a pioneer of flight, and her Goodrich Extra 260 aircraft occupies the same gallery at the Smithsonian as Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Vega.
I have to admit, what I do seems like a pretty dangerous way to make a living. I suppose that's part of the appeal, why so many people come out to see me fly, and to see me take these risks. But, as fellow pilots, I'll let you in on a little secret. There's risk, all right. As you know, anytime you climb into an aircraft, there's risk. But over the years, I've learned to minimize that risk by careful preparation, training, planning, common sense, and constant situational awareness. Attention to safety keeps me alive in the air. But safety doesn't begin at the top of an inverted loop. Safety begins on the ground before you get in your airplane.
As pilots, most of us have seen a great deal of change in airport operations over the past few years. Today, there are nearly 70 million tower operations annually, and the number is growing each year. Pilots are challenged with more and more complex air traffic procedures, more complicated airport layout design. More and more, it is an environment of very real risk. But just as Patty Wagstaff has developed strategies for mitigating risk in the air, pilots can do the same on the ground by following standard procedures, such as using airport diagrams and planning their taxi routes.
The great majority of runway incursions are caused by pilot error. And the great majority of those errors, more than 70%, are caused by general aviation pilots. Those of us who have been flying for a while remember that they didn't teach us much about runway safety back in the days when we were in training. In recent years, that's changed. The FAA has developed a number of educational programs and strategies to help pilots improve runway safety. In fact, with more than 650,000 pilots and more than 240,000 aircraft all conducting millions of operations around the clock, it's amazing how safe our airports are. But still, with the best of training, collisions can happen at any airport, at any time, to any pilot. We may be good pilots, but we are also human. And sometimes we make very human mistakes.
And ground Cessna 9308. Say again.
Runway incursions are most often the result of a loss of situational awareness. For a variety of reasons, the pilot becomes confused by the airport's signs and layout, or doesn't listen to or understand the controller's instructions, or simply fails to follow instructions.
Cessna 3 Sierra Papa.
Hold short, runway 26 left.
453 Sierra Papa, hold short, runway 26 left.
Cessna 3 Sierra Papa, you're over the whole line.
Often this is because he or she is unfamiliar with the airport, the pilot's fatigued, or is distracted by something in the cockpit.
You know what I was doing last night?
For a few critical seconds, pilots lose track of where they are in relation to their surroundings.
You can imagine how important it is for me to focus on situational awareness. In the air, my life depends on it. If I don't know precisely where I am and where I'm going, and the tasks required to get me there, the consequences could be catastrophic. And the same goes for you and for me on the ground.
One of the first keys to situational awareness is attention to detail even before you start your engine. Just as we always study area charts and weather information before we fly, it's important to be thoroughly familiar with the airport's layout before we taxi. Every airport is different, so it's important to obtain and study airport diagrams. Pay particular attention to complex or confusing runway and taxiway intersections and runway thresholds. Some airports publish hotspots on their airport diagrams. For example, intersections, where pilots should be especially vigilant. Obviously, we should make a similar study of the airport at our destination. Once you are thoroughly familiar with the airport layout, make sure you review the signs you will encounter as you taxi toward the active runway. Some simple phrases can help you remember what the signs mean. Black square, you're there. These black signs tell you which runway or taxiway you're on right now. Yellow array points the way. These yellow signs with black arrows point you toward a runway or a taxiway or toward a destination, such as a ramp. If you see white numerals on a red sign, remember, red and white, runways in sight. This type of sign shows the hold position for the runway. Remember, yellow markings represent taxiways and white markings represent runways.
Welcome back, and we'll get started by taking a look at the marine forecast for Southeast Alaska for Wednesday. Expect generally variable winds to northwest winds 15 knots in the southern outside waters in the middle, southern inside waters and the middle inside waters. Winds are going to increase to south 25 knots in the afternoon up into the Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area. The outside waters, expect south to southwest winds 10 to 15 knots in the southern outside waters, and south winds 20 knots as you move on up to the northern outside waters and that east Gulf Coast. Taking a look at that area for Thursday, generally speaking, 10 to 15 knot northwesterly winds in the central and southern inside waters. Winds variable during the morning hours, becoming south about 10 to 15 knots in that Lynn Canal Glacier Bay area. Along the outer coastal waters, expect your winds out of the northwest about 10 to 15 knots for the entire region. For the south central region on Wednesday, expect winds to be out of the east, 15 to 25 knots from Prince William Sound down to the North Gulf Coast, 20 knots as we get south of the Seward area out of the northeast. Winds becoming somewhat variable in the Barren Islands, 15 knots, and then across Kodiak Island, west to southwest winds, 25 knots, including Shelikof Strait. If we move on up to the Augustine area and the Cook Inlet region, south to southwest winds, 15 knots, with winds light and variable in the northern Cook Inlet region. By Thursday, expect your winds to be out of the east 10 knots in Prince William Sound, 20 knots south of the Sound, northeast 15 knots as we move south of the Seward area, and around Kodiak Island, expect your winds to be out of the east northeast around 10 to 15 knots right on up through the Barren Islands, and then Cook Inlet, generally light and variable winds around 10 knots to slightly northeast winds in the southern Cook Inlet region. Taking a look at the Alaska Peninsula for Wednesday, expect your winds to be out of the west 25 knots south of the Alaska Peninsula, southwest 30 knots on the north side of the peninsula, and 25 knots in the Bristol Bay area. By Thursday, expect your winds to let up quite a bit in the Bristol Bay area, west at 10 knots. South of the Alaska Peninsula, expect your winds to be out of the north 15 knots to the east, and 25 knot northwesterly winds south of the Sandpoint and King Cove area, with west winds 20 knots on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula. Taking a look out to the Aleutian Islands for Wednesday, expect your winds to be out of the west to southwest across the entire region, 30 knots over the eastern Aleutian Islands, 25 knots as we move a little bit further to the west, just west of Nikolsky, to 20 to 25 knots as we move out towards Adak and Atka, 20 knots in the Amchitka area with winds out of the southwest, 20 knots out towards Shemya. By Thursday, expect the winds to be still westerly over the eastern Aleutian Islands at about 20 knots, south as we move on to just west of Nikolsky at 20 knots, south to southeast 20 knots across Adak and Atka, southeast 20 knots as we move on out to the Amchitka area with winds out of the northeast about 20 knots as we get on out towards Shemya. Taking a look now at the Bering Sea coastal waters. Expect west winds 30 knots across the Pribilof Islands. Southwest winds 25 knots outside of Kuskokwim Bay, 20 knots north of Nunavak Island out of the west. As you move on up towards the St. Lawrence Island region, expect the winds to be out of the east-northeast, about 25 knots there, and then northwesterly winds about 25 knots across the St. Matthew Island area. Kind of looks odd, but this is where that low pressure system is, so that's why that circulation is like that. On Thursday, expect the winds to be out of the north from St. Lawrence Island down across the Nunavak Island region to outside Kuskokwim Bay, about 15 to 20 knots. Variable winds 10 knots across the Pribilof Islands, with winds out of the southeast at about 15 knots in the St. Matthew Island. Really, it's somewhat variable in that area. Along the Arctic coast, expect your winds to be out of the north from outside Kotzebue Sound right on around the coast to just west of Barrow. 25 knots outside of Kotzebue Sound, 20 knots as you move a little bit further north, and then 15 knots over by Point Lay. 15 knot easterly winds over by Barrow, and then east of Barrow, expect the east winds about 25 knots. By Thursday, the winds east of Barrow drop off to 20 knots, remaining out of the east. By Barrow, expect east winds about 15 knots. Then as we move on over towards the Point Lay area, north winds 15 knots, and then north winds 25 knots from Point Hope right on down to outside of Kotzebue Sound. And for a quick recap across the state tonight, basically cloudy, wet conditions, some isolated thunderstorm activity across much of the interior, rain continuing along the North Gulf Coast and southeast Alaska, and rain spreading on in across the eastern Bering Sea to the Bering Sea coastal areas. By tomorrow, we'll see pretty much widespread rains overspreading the Bering Sea coastal areas. That's going to continue to push inland. Rain and isolated thunderstorm activity can be expected over our low pressure system up into the eastern interior, with some rain along the North Gulf Coast and Prince William Sound, as well as southeast Alaska. We're out of time for the show this evening. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.